As almost every American knows, issues of race have been a significant force in shaping our nation's past and present. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the Chicago race riots of 1919. I met up with some from our community to see how far we've really come since that summer. It started as a summer day that Chicagoans from any generation could call familiar. A day at the beach, here at 29th Street Beach to be exact, where a century ago, racial tensions in Chicago would come to a boiling point, setting off a week of race riots that would continue to shape the city to this day. But despite the significance of the event, many Chicagoans aren't aware of its place in history.
In presentations that I do time and time again, people come up to me afterward and say, I've lived in Chicago all my life and I never heard about this.
On July 27, 1919, during a particularly bad heat wave, some young black men were rafting in the waters off 29th Street Beach. A white man began throwing stones at the swimmers after they floated into what he saw as the white end of the informally segregated beach. One of the rafters, a Eugene Williams, was killed in the incident. To make matters worse, when the incident was reported to police, the killer was let go and a black man was arrested for minor crimes instead. This may have sparked the riots, but many other factors were also involved. Thousands of African Americans had moved to Chicago during the Great Migration after the Civil War, fleeing violence and lack of opportunity in the South. Many had served in World War I and returned with the knowledge and will to defend themselves.
It escalated quickly, I think, because those soldiers came home and they had been so well received in France and they were treated as humans that it was so cool to be treated as 100% men and fighting a war and winning, that coming back to be regulated to what America had.
African Americans were forced to live on Chicago's South Side, right next to a largely Irish immigrant neighborhood. As opposed to the Jim Crow South, where segregation was formalized into law, Chicago began setting up a system of restrictive covenants in 1916. These covenants made it illegal for African Americans to purchase or occupy land in certain areas of the city.
From 1916 to 1948, black people were relegated to live in the Bronzeville area. We just wanted the freedom. We wanted an alderman. We wanted representation, those kinds of things.
From 1916 to 1919, the African American population in Chicago increased by 148%. This caused Bronzeville to thrive, but also led to overcrowding and a shrinking of perceived borders with white neighbors. Post-war tension, labor competition, and racism created strong resentments between ethnic groups. This led to white provocations against the black community and eventually the riots. Those riots would claim 38 victims in all, 23 black and 15 white, and over 500 reported injuries, two-thirds of those being black. 1,000 to 2,000 people, also mostly black, lost their homes. Despite this, no whites were arrested for any of the killings, and many more blacks than whites were brought to court. In the years following, the city did attempt to reconcile issues of race. In 1922, leaders from both white and black communities convened for the Chicago Commission on Race Relations to investigate the riots.
One of the main things that they bring up in this report was how much the white press, mainstream press, covered crime or emphasized crime, and that was pretty much the main way that they talked about the black community.
Hecker says media trends from the time shared parallels with the media in the decades that followed.
It's interesting that that came out in 1922. This is the Kerner Commission report, which is from 1968, I believe. So it was around the riots in the 60s. And there's a whole chapter in here about the role of the media. And they basically say the exact same thing, that the mainstream media failed to report on the underlying causes of violence, so like the housing shortage, the conditions of housing, unemployment, those types of things. That was like the fuel. Mainstream media didn't cover that and did the same thing, focusing on crime, like overemphasizing crime and stereotypes, and not fully reporting other things that were going on in the community. It's almost identical. It's really crazy to read them next to each other because they're 50 years apart. And so now we're 50 years past this, and I would say we still are having a lot of these issues.
Hecker says focusing on crime accentuated fear and bias between ethnic groups. Meanwhile, the racial tensions of 1919 weren't specific to Chicago. World War I and the Great Migration created strong anti-immigrant and anti-black feelings nationwide.
One of the ways 1919 is with us, and this was really clear in teaching this class, is that in 1919 there was a lot of fear of immigrants. So 1919 came amid what they call the Great Migration. millions, in Chicago's case, hundreds of thousands of African Americans leaving violence in one place and moving to a new place. And the people in that place trying to erect walls, right? So we're living through a time that's very much like that. The people from Central America fleeing violence in Central America, coming to the United States, and this concern with walls, with keeping people out, with establishing borders, with us and them. 1919 is very much about us and them, but there were times when teaching this class I felt like I was teaching about 2019 rather than 1919.
This fear of other people, made worse by the riots, paved the way for the virtual walling off of the city. Chicago is often referred to as one of the more segregated cities in America to this day, an issue that is, in some ways, a legacy of the riots.
Chicago is a city that's divided, and we're divided still. One of the most interesting things about this city is we're one of the most diverse cities in the United States. In other words, we have people from all different ethnic backgrounds, but we're also, and have been, one of the most segregated cities in the United States. And 1919 didn't cause that segregation. It was already there before, but it reinforced the battle lines of that segregation.
With these lines established, certain neighborhoods became cut off from the rest of the city over time. Combined with other factors, this led to the damaging of these neighborhoods that still affects us today.
The violence we have now is very much related to 1919, right? So most of Chicago's gun violence takes place in a relatively small number of neighborhoods.
And while we've made progress in race relations over the past 100 years, the 1919 riots force us to ask ourselves how far we've really come. Many feel police violence against African Americans is still a major issue.
Back in those days, if a police officer killed a black person, they would have absolutely no recourse in terms of the courts. Nothing would be done at all. Now, if you look at, for example, the Laquan McDonald case, which it took a tremendous amount of energy and stick-to-itiveness by the journalist who uncovered the video. But yet, once that was uncovered, there was a trial, and the police officer was convicted, albeit, there were some differences of opinions as to the sentencing that went on. But those kinds of things could never have happened back in 1919. Still, of course, the Laquan McDonald case is just one case. And I read in the papers weekly, not just about Chicago, but about other places around the country where justice does not prevail. And clearly, that's an issue that's still very much with us today.
The bubbles need to be burst on both sides, right? There are people who would say, I would never go to that neighborhood. And why not? There's amazing things happening in every neighborhood in this city. Amazing people who live in every neighborhood in this city. And what a great, great loss for us that we're so separated.
1919 to 2019, 100 years. During that time, Chicago has changed and improved dramatically, but issues of race relations remain with us today. For Good Day to Paul, I'm Michael Abraham.